yesterday, met him last night because he was on the forum, and certainly noticed just how incisive he can be and how he can cut right through to the core of an issue. And as editor of Nexus magazine, he's privy to a lot of hidden information, stuff that we're not normally made privy to except through magazines like Nexus. And in a way that follows on from what Andy was talking about, all those things that we don't really know what is going on. One of the things that, I don't know, why am I saying that? We know all of that. What Marcus is going to be looking at today is catastrophe theories of Immanuel Velikovsky. I think I pronounced that quite well. And he had theories which explained a lot of the events in the Bible stories. And so Marcus is going to be looking at some of that today and picking up some of the observations in particular and seeing what relevance they might have for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcus Allen.
Thank you. If you doubt that what you've been told is the truth, you're in good company. And in fact, you're in increasing company. 300-400 people will be here over this weekend, and we'll be hearing things which to some of us may well be a little startling, to some of us may well be almost old hat, because we've moved on. What we're looking at are what I'm going to be looking at specifically, is Immanuel Velikovsky. Now, there are three things which I think Immanuel Velikovsky brought to the debate. I'll go into a little bit of detail about his life shortly. What I want to talk about today, just three things. One is the dating of history, specifically biblical history, Egyptian history, and from that, everything else derives. I'd also like to look at the catastrophic theories of Immanuel Velikovsky. Behind me, you will see what I call my washing line, because it holds dates. That washing line, from that side to that side, is what we're told is the age of the Earth. Now, it is very precisely and scientifically constructed to illustrate the age. Each of the billion-year divisions are precisely 1 meter apart. 1 meter consists of 1,000 millimeters. On that scale you're looking at, 1 millimeter is 1 million years. So if you look at the top of the arrow, where we are today, 4.5 billion years, the top of the arrow represents recorded history. Well, not actually, 1 million years, it's a bit too long. It's almost too small to identify. That 1 billion years between those two, for instance, there, is a long time. So we're at the top of the arrow here. Well, what happened the rest of the time? Now, this is what we've been told. This is what we've been told. And the reason that we're told the Earth is 4.5 billion years old is actually quite recent. So let's just have a quick look at planet Earth, the pale blue dot. Oh, by the way, this is a postmodern demonstration. I'm just more comfortable that way. Planet Earth, recognize it? Saudi Arabia, Africa, Horn of Africa, down here Madagascar, down here Antarctica. It's a beautiful place. That's where we all live. We can't get off it. We'll never get off it. We're not designed to travel in space. We're not designed to go anywhere much beyond about 50 miles up. So we've got to make the best of it. Now, in order to explain history, many eminent scientists have come up with rather outlandish theories. But one of the most outlandish, in many respects, is biblical history. If you go into any bookshop and look at current publications of the Bible, current editions of the Bible, you won't find them looking like that. That is an old family Bible. It was published in 1860. And you'll notice something quite interesting about it. In the top left-hand corner is a date. Before Christ, 4004. Okay? Pretty obvious, really, what that means. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In 4004 BC. Do we know how that date got there? Do we know why that is such a precise date? It's very straightforward. King James authorized the publication of the Bible in 1611. And it was to be translated into English from Latin, Greek, which very few people could read. In fact, in 1611, very few people could read anyway, including King James himself. So he appointed a committee to translate the Bible and to publish it in English for use in churches, hence authorized version, authorized by the king to be read in churches, in the language that people could understand. Now, having translated the Bible into English, some bright spark, his name was Bishop Usher of Armagh, decided to look into the Bible and, taking a known date, let's say the building of the Temple of Solomon in 1000 BC, an agreed upon date, he calculated using all the begats that are in Genesis and Exodus, calculated them backwards from a known date to the day of creation. Who were the first man and woman on earth? Adam and Eve. And he worked out when they lived, hence 4004 BC. It's a very simple calculation, anybody can do it. They even give in the Bible the ages of these people. So they calculate the date, 4004. Now, that may sound like a bit of a fairy story, a bit, oh well, okay, so what? Go back to 1611, 1620. The church was all-powerful. Very few people could read or write. What they were told in their churches was what they believed. If they didn't believe it, they were heretics. You know what happened to heretics? Burnt at the stake. So you believed. And that's what people believed. For 250 years, that's what people believed. We're here in the 21st century. We don't believe that, do we? We believe versions of it. Now, having persuaded people that the earth was 6,000 years old or thereabouts, in 1859, a gentleman by the name of Darwin, Charles Darwin, came along, published his book, Origin of Species. Anybody here read it? Right, thought not. Everybody here has heard of it. It's actually quite an easy book to read. Darwin himself was not a scientist. He was a member of the Fellow of the Royal Society, and he was a doctor of literature, which meant he wrote well, and he did. But he wasn't a scientist. He came up with this theory of his. He didn't agree with many of the interpretations put on it, but the key to this book is not the fact of what it said. Survival of the luckiest, actually, is the best interpretation of it. Think about it. If you are the fittest, you don't necessarily, you're possibly in the wrong place when the volcano goes off. If you're the lucky ones, you're out of the way. Anyway, this book was published, and its message was immediately obvious to the evolving science of the day, the archaeologists, the biologists, the paleontologists, the anthropologists, that here was a means whereby they could interpret what they perceived to be the correct version of history, not the biblical version, which they could now sideline. And for the last 150-odd years, that is the battle that's been going on, the battle between creationists and evolutionists. Now, if Darwin was right, according to these scientists, that man evolved by natural selection, it must have taken a long time. Things didn't happen fast. It was gradual. It was a very slow process. It just went on and on. Remember the finches with beaks that could use particular seeds as opposed to other seeds? This was in the Galapagos Islands. So things had to take a long time. That's why we have the washing line. Because in order for Darwin to be right, things had to take an incredibly long time to happen. That's great. We've now got enough time for evolution to take place. And that's the only reason why we have these strange dates. If you look at the conventional history of mankind, you get two opposing views. Some of you are familiar with Michael Cremer's work. Michael Cremer has done some very interesting research into the archaeological history of mankind. This is the conventional scenario on the left, where you get down to 1 million years, you get a few apes. Basically, nothing much has happened. You get a few apes. So, people at the back may not be necessarily able to read this. We do have copies of some of these slides if you want to have a look at them, or you can buy the book, which is even better. We have apes who do their thing, birds. We have the fossil record. Remember the coelacanth, the fish that was extinct for millions of years, suddenly appeared in a fisherman's net off Madagascar in 1938. I rather upset the apple cart. But that is 1 billion years old, apparently, according to the record. Now, the alternative record is completely different. We get down to 100 million years, or even 500 million years ago. Admittedly, that's not very far on the famous evolutionary scale we got here. It's only 500 million years, it's only back here, to the 4 billion year point. We get gold chains, we get metal tubes, we get human footprints, and other things which imply intelligent man has been around on this planet for hundreds, if not thousands of millions of years. The way they were dated was in the geology of the strata in which these objects were found. Very conflicting with the existing view. It also ties in a little bit with what Andy was talking about earlier today, how one is persuaded to believe something. It doesn't have to be true, you just have to be persuaded to believe it because it fits the existing paradigm. Now, one of the people who has challenged that paradigm is Immanuel Velikovsky. Immanuel Velikovsky was born in 1895 in Russia. He moved to Edinburgh, where he studied medicine. He went back to Russia in the 1920s. He moved to Vienna, Zurich, and eventually settled in Palestine in the 1920s, late 1920s, where he practiced psychoanalysis. He'd studied under William Steckel, who was one of the first pupils of Jung and Freud. He studied with Freud. So he was a polymath, if you like. He was a multifaceted scientist. He spoke several languages. Obviously, he spoke Russian, he spoke French, he spoke German, obviously English. In 1938, he took time out and went to America. In 1939, obviously we know what happened, Second World War, so basically he stayed in America for the rest of his life from 1938 onwards. And while he was studying, he asked himself a question. The question was there any record in Egyptian history of the 10 plagues of Egypt as recorded in the Bible, in the book of Exodus? The 10 plagues of Egypt. They were the plagues which drove the Israelites out of Egypt into what became Palestine, what is now Israel. So the question, was there any record in Egyptian history of the 10 plagues as recorded in the Bible? It's recorded in the Bible, And if you look in your Bible that has dates on it, you'll see there's a date to the 10 plagues. It's 1450 BC. And nobody knew if there was any record in Egyptian history, because this was obviously a major event. What was going on? A major event in biblical history recorded in the Old Testament, but apparently not recorded in Egypt. So is it a myth? Is it fiction? Is it something which somebody's made up? No, it wasn't. Velikovsky eventually found the reference. It was in what's called the Ipuwer, I-P-U-W-E-R, Ipuwer papyrus. It's now in the Leiden Museum in Holland. You can see it. You can't read it necessarily unless you read hieroglyphics. But it records the event which we know as the plagues of Egypt. Now, these plagues were not ordinary things. They were powerful events. They describe hail. But if you look at the original Hebrew, the word translated into hail, the Hebrew word is barad, which means stones. Now, at the time it was translated, nobody had the faintest idea what could be stones coming down from the sky. We know them as meteorites. But at the time, the scientists at the time had no idea. So it was translated as hail, which is a little bit disconcerting. Velikovsky asked the question, he answered it to his own satisfaction, that there was a record in Egypt. So it was recorded in 2 places, all right, adjoining countries. Egypt and Palestine are adjoining countries. And he wrote his first book. His first book recorded that event. And his first book was, the first book he wrote, not the first book he published, was Ages and Chaos. The first book that was published was Worlds in Collision. Now, anybody here not heard of this book? Oh, not heard of it? Okay. Very few people not heard of the book Worlds in Collision. All I'll say, it is one of the classics of the 20th century. Worlds in Collision. It's probably the best known. Velikovsky actually wrote 7 books. And I won't ask here who has read all 7 of them, because I know what the answer will be. Has there anybody here actually read all 7? No. Okay. Velikovsky's been forgotten. He's been sidelined. Hence, very few people know about him. But if you look in any of the major works, you're familiar with Graham Hancock's work, I expect. You're familiar with Eric von Daniken's work. You're familiar with the work of many of the modern writers into alternative history. Look in the bibliography. Virtually all of them will reference this book, plus some of the other ones. Worlds in Collision. The title gives you the clue as to what he's talking about. Because having discovered that the plagues in Egypt was then recorded, this was a major event. So what caused them? This was the research he did into this book. Basically, the history we have, which was then proposed by the people who came up with the idea of the uniform and slow process of, I'll put this over, the slow process of history, were persisting in the idea of uniformitarianism. Everything happened very slowly. What Velikovsky identified was that things didn't happen very slowly all the time. There were periods of gradual process, periods of gradual time passing. But occasionally there would be extremely violent, catastrophic events. Extremely violent. Now, what are the major natural disasters? You can probably think of most of them. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tsunamis. These are natural disasters. But they're local. All right, they're devastating to anybody who happens to be involved, but they are local. The tsunami we're all familiar with, but it affected a very small part of the Earth's surface. What we're looking at here is an event which could affect the whole planet. Now, what event could affect the whole planet? Everybody on the planet is aware of it, is frightened by it, can do nothing about it. Something approaching from space. Another planet. A comet. A meteor. Something is visible. That is the only thing that can cause a catastrophic event on worldwide scale. Ask one question. What creates a fossil? We know they exist. How are fossils formed? If you bury your dog in your back garden, it'll never become a fossil. The worms will get it. It'll decay. If an elephant keels over and dies in Africa, it'll never become a fossil. The hyenas will get it. The 60 million bison that were slaughtered in America in the 19th century, not one of them, there's no record of any of them left. They've gone. They've been scavenged, they've been removed. So what creates a fossil? We know fossils exist. We've got dinosaurs, we've got birds, we've got all sorts of weird and wonderful creatures. It's basically the exclusion of oxygen. So it has to be buried in a volcanic explosion or a major catastrophic event. Has those happened? Have there been worldwide catastrophic events? This was the other question that Velikovsky asked himself. And he came up with the answer. And the answer was unequivocal. He published the answers in Earth in Upheaval. Again, the title gives you the clue. Earth in Upheaval. This was written in the early 1950s, before we had anything called a space program, anything called scientific explorations. These were events recorded back in the 19th century where you have erratics. Now, erratic is a rock, and some of them are huge, 10,000 tons or more. Huge rocks which are in places they shouldn't be. There's one in Switzerland with a village built on top of it, and the rock, you can identify it from the structure of the rock, came from Norway. But it shouldn't be in Switzerland. You then start looking at floods. Well, we all know about floods. There's one in the Bible. Noah got advance warning. Isn't it interesting? Noah had advance warning. Various reasons are offered as to why he had advance warning, but the simple answer, this is the use of Occam's razor, the simple answer is usually the more likely one, where less assumptions have to be made about how the answer is arrived at. Noah had advance warning, and he had enough time to build quite a large boat. He had advance warning because he saw it, as everybody saw it, an advancing planet, advancing on Earth, on collision course with Earth. It's recorded in the Bible, it's recorded in Greek history, it's recorded in Roman history, it's recorded in Chinese, in Indian, it's recorded in Hindu history. These things are recorded, they're there. But if you don't look at them realistically, you will say they're the myths and legends of forgotten, distant people. They're not myths, they're history. The Bible is basically a historical document. It records events. If you get the dating of it, which the old Bibles have, you can see it quite easily. Hence, you know that Noah built the ark in about 2300 BC. You know that Solomon built his temple in about 2015. You know that Saul was Solomon's grandfather. David was his father. He was an important character. He got taken off by Nebuchadnezzar. The Bible records a pretty accurate history that can be cross-checked. So what you've got is a history which appears to be at variance. What Velikovsky was recording was at variance with the existing paradigm of history. Now, the main thing that Velikovsky is remembered for is that his book was banned, suppressed. His book was vilified. He was accused of being a fraud. He was accused of all manner of things. We're very familiar with that type of attack because we've seen it on Von Daniken had the same thing. Graham Hancock had the same thing. John Anthony West had the same thing. Many people who've come up with paradigm-threatening theories which have been backed up by hard factual evidence are attacked. So you know you're on the right line when you're attacked. So if anybody wants to attack me, great, it's I'm on the right line. Because what it does is to upset the people who consider that they control the access to the knowledge that people believe. And as soon as you do that, you're in deep trouble, serious trouble, and you have to be prepared to be attacked and defend yourself. It's not a pleasant experience. Velikovsky went through this. What happened was that the book Worlds in Collision was an academic book. It was perceived to be an academic book. It is very deeply referenced. Every statement he makes is referenced and cross-checked. And for a book of that sort, an academic publisher would seem to be the obvious choice. And the company which took up the option to publish his book, Worlds in Collision, was Macmillan in America. Now, Macmillan is an academic book publisher. It was then, it is now. I.e., the other people it published were academics. They were scientists, they were astronomers, they were physicists, chemists, biologists in the universities in America. Because of the threat to their scholarship, to put about, not put too fine a point on it, because of the threat perceived by a man who at the time was acknowledged as being an extremely accurate and careful researcher, this is Immanuel Velikovsky, the book was perceived to be a threat. And there were various people who took it upon themselves, Harlow Shapley being one of them. He was the equivalent of the Astronomer Royal in Britain. He was an eminent astronomer at Harvard. He took it upon himself to have the book removed from the titles published by the Macmillan Book Company. He also engineered the dismissal of the editor, James Putnam, who had agreed to publish Worlds in Collision. And this was without having read the book. He made almost a fetish of the fact that he had not read Worlds in Collision, but he'd heard discussions and read brief reviews. And that was the basis of his attack. It was a vicious, unpleasant, and personal attack on Immanuel Velikovsky. But by that time, what was happening was becoming public knowledge. A lot of people were aware that a book had been published that was being heavily attacked by the scientific community. And Doubleday were then given the rights to publish. They were a popular book publisher then, as they are today, and they took up the publication of all Velikovsky's books. Worlds in Collision became an international bestseller. It sold millions of copies, primarily because everybody had heard about it. But the attack still continued. Velikovsky continued writing. But unfortunately, this is in the mid-1950s, there was very little, if you like, alternative media, people who could identify what was going on. So what was happening was that the book took on the reputation of the man. The man was a charlatan. The book couldn't possibly be anything worth reading, and so it was ignored for a long time. It has remained in print ever since. And if you go up to the Labyrinth bookshop, which I checked out yesterday, they have one copy of Worlds in Collision and one copy of Ages and Chaos. First one there gets it, second-hand copies. They're not published new books, but they are available in second-hand bookshops. Why should this be? Why should this incredible behavior, which is almost irrational behavior, be something which is which was exhibited by what you'd expect to be scientists who should know better? The clue is in the moon. Here's the moon. Nice place. Allegedly, a couple of people have been there. I say allegedly. I don't know where the evidence is. We'll not get into that. That's the Copernicus crater. Copernicus, famous astronomer. And the Copernicus crater is 60 miles in diameter. We're told it's an impact crater, as is the Sea of Tranquility here, which is about 400 miles in diameter. It's completely flat, but we're told it's an impact crater which has been filled up with lava. Ditto the Sea of Serenity, ditto, I forget what that one's called, doesn't really matter, but they're big seas, they're mares, that's what they're called, because that's what they look like. More craters, more craters. There's lots of 300,000 craters on the lunar surface. It's a small place. relative to the Earth. More craters here, but they're all flat. They're not bowl-shaped. Now, some people here I know have been to Meteor Crater in America. That is an impact crater. Impact craters are very easy to spot. They're saucer-shaped. It's physics. You can actually calculate. If you get a lump of rock traveling at large speed, 40, 50,000 miles an hour, impacting a planet, it will leave a crater 8 times diameter to depth. That's how they make it. That's more or less what Meteor Crater is. It's 8 times as wide as it is deep. So what are these? 60 miles wide, should be at least 10 miles deep. It's at the most 2, maybe 3 miles deep, which doesn't seem to feature in the physics of craters. It's a bit of a close-up one. And you can see here, it looks rather like a coal mine, open-cast coal mine. Now, these are impact craters. They're fairly obvious. This isn't, that isn't. That is, that isn't. Once you know what to look for, they're easy. What you're looking for are flat floors, flat bases. You're possibly looking for a central peak in the middle, but you're looking for flat floors. What creates a crater with a flat floor and a terraced wall? Anybody who's done any welding will tell you electric arcs will do that. This is an internal view of Copernicus crater. You can see the terracing on the walls. Instead of being impact craters, these are electric discharge craters. And Peter mentioned this yesterday, that a lot of modern research is identifying that the world is not just, the solar system is not held in place purely by gravitation, which is what Isaac Newton claimed, because Isaac Newton didn't know what electricity was. It hadn't been invented, if you like. Nobody had identified electricity. It took Faraday to do that about 150 years later. So Newton comes up with the only explanation he can think of, given the knowledge he has. As knowledge is acquired, better information is available, and more realistic explanations can be offered. If this is an electric discharge crater, we live in an electric universe. And again, the sun is not a giant nuclear reactor. It's basically a ball of electricity. It's not actually that hot, close to, about 6,000 degrees. It's not very hot. Because if it was, the closer you got to it, the hotter you'd get. And you don't. It is powerful. It's a huge thing, the sun. But if it's an electric universe we live in, the whole of celestial mechanics needs to be rethought. This was one of the points that Velikovsky came up with, of his study of various aspects of the catastrophic theories that he was proposing for evidence on Earth. And of course, that sent the astronomers completely doolally. You couldn't have an electric universe. Because to cap it all, he then said that the planet Venus didn't start life as a planet, it started life as a comet ejected from the planet Jupiter. Remember the planet Jupiter, otherwise known as Zeus, the chief of the gods? Firing thunderbolts. Planet Venus is a little bit smaller than Earth. Firing thunderbolts, what does that indicate? Electric discharges? Hang on a minute. Are we seeing something that the evidence exists for? We are. We're seeing it. We see it on the moon, but we don't see it on Earth. Oh no, we're told everything happens so slowly, it all has worn away. There's only 200 craters visible on Earth. They may well be impact craters. There will be some. Remember the famous one that in Mexico, or near Mexico, that wiped out the dinosaurs very conveniently? Because they're all fossilized. We dug up a mammoth the other day in Siberia that was virtually intact. Its eyeballs were still intact. A mammoth in Siberia? What's it doing there? No, it's not a cold animal. I mean, it doesn't live in a cold part of the world. It's got fur on, but so have tigers. Tigers don't live in the Arctic. Tigers live in the tropics. Polar bears live in the Arctic. Other bears live in the tropics. You don't need a furry coat like hairy mammoth to live in the Arctic, because they don't get buttercups in the Arctic, and that's what they were eating. However, another indication that something strange has happened to this planet. When Velikovsky suggested not only was the sun not hot, as hot as it claimed to be, but the planet Venus, as we now know it, was a comet originally ejected from Jupiter that went into orbit around the sun and passed very close to the orbit of the Earth, close enough to affect the surface of the Earth. Now, we all know that the moon exists, because you've only got to look out the window at night, and there it is. Well, half the month it's there. We live on planet Earth here. Just to give an idea of the scales involved, I like to bring my world with me. Planet Earth, our home, where we live. There's a moon out there. Now, let's assume that this is the moon. Relative sizes are correct. The Earth is 8,000 miles in diameter, the moon is 2,000 miles in diameter. This is 1 foot in diameter, this is 3 inches in diameter. So relatively, these are the correct size, but it's obviously a lot further away. If you put planet Earth here, the moon on this scale will be by that back chandelier, hanging from it. But I thought, well, I won't hang it from it. It might pull the chandelier down. I don't want to do a Del Boy explanation of dropping chandeliers. So the moon is 30 feet away by that third chandelier, that size. What does the moon do? What are we most familiar with the moon doing? The tides. The moon goes on an orbit around the Earth once every 28, 29 days. And the tides occur twice a day. Something that small can produce some fairly huge changes on Earth. But we're familiar with the tides. We know what they do. We don't get in the way when they come in, unless you're in Morecambe Bay when you've got to run pretty fast to get out of the way. Tides are powerful things. Now, imagine something the size of the Earth coming between the Earth and the moon. What effect would that have? Catastrophic is the answer. It would not only produce tides of gigantic size, it would produce them over a long period of time, and you would see it coming. So let's say you've got a huge illuminated ball of light up in the sky, like the sun, not quite as bright, like the sun, but you know it's a lot closer because it's moving relatively fast across your horizon. You know that it's approaching Earth because it's getting bigger. You don't know if it's going to be on collision course with Earth, but you know it's going to get close enough to affect Earth. Having got close enough, as it approaches, all the water is drawn towards it. As it moves around, the water follows it. The closer it gets, the more water is drawn towards that planet. And as it passes and goes away, the water recedes. That's the flood. That's what we call the flood. We saw the effect of the tsunami in India and Indonesia 3 years ago. Terrible, devastating, relatively small compared to what we'd have here. Earth in Upheaval recounts the effect of the movement of planet Venus close to Earth. And it's spectacularly devastating. If you're in the way, you're just not going to survive. You're going to get seriously upset. You're going to get hit. You're going to get buried, basically. You're going to get what we see in Alaska today, 100-foot high cliffs of trees and animal bones mashed up together. You better ask yourself one other question. Where do piano keys come from? In the 19th century, there was a huge production of pianos, and all the keys are ivory. Ivory is very beautiful. Where did that come from? Where did that ivory come from? Did they slaughter elephants for it? No. They're mammoth tusks from Siberia. The Siberian islands, just inside the Arctic Circle, north of Siberia, are not islands of Earth, they're islands of mammoths. The mammoth tusks are huge, and the Russian traders had identified them at the beginning part of the 19th century and brought them out and sold them through China. That's why the Chinese are such expert ivory carvers. Virtually every billiard ball, piano key made in the 19th and early part of the 20th century is made of mammoth tusks. How did they get there? I mean, mammoths eat grass and trees like elephants do today. Siberia is full of ice. They wouldn't survive. That's not why they're hairy either. They were there because that was a natural habitat for them. The world we see today has changed very dramatically, very recently. And it was changed by water. I don't think we need to go too much into the effect of water. I think we're all familiar with it, very close to here. Just a little bit of water, not even moving water, but just rising water, can devastate a community. It can drown houses, you can get out of the way because the communities have been able to, but they couldn't take their houses, and the houses were flooded. Now, supposing that water was moving as fast as a tsunami, those houses wouldn't survive. Nothing would survive. Absolutely nothing. No tree, no building, no animal would survive. But if you couldn't get out of the way, what would happen? You would just get swept along with it. That's what erratics are. They were moved by water. Water is the most powerful force when it moves at speed. You cannot stop it. You cannot do anything about it. You will be devastated by it. That's what happened on Earth relatively recently. The first major event recorded in history, because you can say, well, surely it would have been recorded. I mean, who is this idiot talking about floods and deluges? And certainly, no, he's just quoting from the Bible. No. Every culture, every major culture on the planet records a flood legend. I say everyone, except two. Egypt and Japan do not record a flood legend. Virtually every other country does. Every other culture does. From Alaska to Patagonia, China, India, Siberia, everywhere. But if you haven't looked, you wouldn't know it. Velikovsky looked. He knew it. The record is there. The first event that occurred that he found the evidence for was the close passage of the planet Venus in about 1500 BC. There had been other floods and deluges before that. And we heard quite a lot about the end of the Ice Age. That is a slightly different deluge when you get melting ice. This global warming nonsense is all about, the ice caps will melt and we'll all drown. No, it doesn't work that way. There's a very simplistic view of ice caps don't melt. By the way, talking of glaciers, as I was, anybody know how many glaciers there are in the world? 160,000. How many of them are melting? All of them. That's what glaciers do. They melt. How many of them are extending? About half. How many of them are decreasing? About half. There's one on top of Kilimanjaro that's actually disappeared. Why has it disappeared? Well, how's a glacier formed in the first place? It's snow, frozen rain. Where does the rain come from? It's evaporation of, in the case of Kilimanjaro, the rainforest around it. Go up by heat, come down as snow. But they cut the rainforest down. No rain, no snow. Glacier gone. Simple. There's no basic problem with the science of glaciers. If you like a good book by a good author, which will explain virtually all of the global warming business, State of Fear by Michael Crichton. He's the guy who wrote ER, Jurassic Park. He knows his stuff. It's a thriller, but it's a good book. So when glaciers melt, yes, they produce a lot of water, but you have to have the conditions for them to melt in. What was happening as the planet Venus comes by, it doesn't just affect the oceans, it affects the mantle, it affects the liquid core of the Earth as well. Hence you get the volcanic eruption. The Deccan Flats in India may not have been created by that. The Deccan Flats are 250,000 square miles of volcanic rock on the north-central part of India, several thousand feet thick. It came from inside the Earth. We hear about Atlantis, we hear about Lemuria that disappeared, but nobody can find the evidence for it, so it can't be real. Well, how recently did the Himalayas move up? How recently did the Andes, were they created? We're told they're quite recent. There are there's fossils that have been taken off the top of Himalayas which show it was once under the sea because there are marine animals around that were in the rocks which are now 5 miles up. So what you have is a large planetary body. We'll call it the planet Venus. It could be the planet Mars. That came a bit later because the solar system has not always been the stable clockwork image that we have today. We know where the planets are, we know what they do, they're all in their place, they all do their thing. They haven't always been that. They haven't always done that. The ancient astronomers knew that. Now, those of you who were here yesterday and we were on the panel, I said, what was the difference between astronomy and astrology? And there is a major difference between the two. Both are vital. Astronomers study the heavens, the stars. Astrologers identify the influence of the planets. Why should this be? Why should the influence of the planets be of importance to us? So important that to be an astrologer in years past was a noble calling. It still is today. But the influence of the planets on Earth originated because they weren't always in the position they're in now, and it was necessary to identify that if they're going to move, what effect will that have on us? So if the planet Venus, which has not always been recorded as the fifth of the visible planets, there are 5 visible planets now: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Babylonians actually only record 4. They don't record Venus as being visible. So it was somewhere else. It's only recently that Venus has settled into the orbit that we know it's in today, relatively close to Earth, a relative distance away from Earth, as has Mars. Mars hasn't always been in the orbit it is. This was some of the things that Velikovsky was saying. So you could imagine, I mean, even discussing them now in the 21st century, they're a little bit startling. You could imagine what effect they had back in the 1950s. That's why he was vilified, ignored, and basically his name was erased from history. I consider it is necessary now that he is reevaluated, because those who are familiar with the work that he has done and the books that he's written are grateful for the groundbreaking work that he did. And this is a scholar, this is a scientist who devoted his life to this work. He died in 1979 in America. And this final book was published 2 years after his death. He'd written it beforehand, and it was called Mankind in Amnesia. Now, Mankind in Amnesia, does that ring a bell? Have you heard that phrase before? Graham Hancock refers to it in his book, Fingerprints of the Gods. He says, humans are like a race with amnesia, like we've forgotten our past. Okay, I don't know if there are any psychologists here, so if what I'm going to explain isn't quite right, you'll no doubt correct me in due course. If you, as an individual, experience a devastating, life-threatening event, a terrible car crash, something very violent that is seriously going to damage you, you think you're about to die and you don't, you will go through what we call today extreme trauma. You can be cancelled, people will get through it, but you will tend not to remember. you will tend to blank it out. It's too painful. The memory of what you've experienced is so painful. In order to get on with your life, you prefer to leave it in the past where it was. Supposing, as I mentioned earlier, the human race experienced a trauma of such devastation that it was virtually wiped out. There are a lot of records to indicate that the human race only just survived several of these extinctions. We talk about wildlife extinction and how we're going to lose the lesser spotted butterfly of some description or some other animal. And it's not a pleasant thing to believe that a creature that shares our planet may well be extinct as a result of our own actions. But if the human race was threatened with extinction, and 90, maybe 95% of the people alive were suddenly not alive, that means that just the front row in this auditorium survived and everybody else gone. The front row is going to be, what on earth happened? What do I do now? And we've had an interesting example of the worst thing that can happen when there's a flood. There's no drinking water. It's all contaminated. Yes, it would be. If the sea came in over the planet, if there were electric arcs going on, if there were such devastating events going on, hurricanes, huge events covering the planet Earth, and the front row here survived, all 10 of you, you would wonder, what do I do next? You might not even survive yourself, because if you can't find drinking water within about 48 hours, you are dead. That's how close it comes. What Velikovsky identified was that the man had experienced a trauma of such devastation that amnesia was the only way you could survive. It's the way a lot of people do survive. What you get are flashes. You get shadows on your memory, flashbacks. Oh. Something triggers the memory. What was that? And then you try to relive it. You know that you have to try and remember. Because it was devastation, the way we relive that demonstration is through warfare, through violence. It's almost a natural response that humans have. It's not a natural response, because overriding that is one factor which keeps coming back. It's referred to by many different names: the Golden Age, Utopia, the Elysian Fields, Xanadu, Lost Horizon. They're all flashes of what happened before, the civilization that existed before mankind was virtually wiped out. Yes, there was a golden age. Maybe we're here in this room because collectively we are familiar with the idea that this could have been, and that say, well, is there anybody who can tell me how to get there? Where is it? What do I have to do? Because that appears to many people to be a far greater ambition, a far greater belief than what we have at the moment. We look around at what we have today, the ridiculous performance that we see going on internationally and politically. And we say, no, it wasn't always like that. It was different. It was better. There was a time when mankind actually progressed, were good to each other, liked each other, wanted to work together. Why can't we have it again? We can. We just have to take the advice of any half-decent psychologist and say, well, how do you get mankind through the trauma of virtual extinction? So if there are any volunteers, we'll have a word later. The final point, how are we doing time-wise? 2 minutes. Thank you. Was the redating of Egyptian history. Velikovsky made some rather startling points about Egyptian history, which of course upset all the Egyptologists, as you could imagine. They're very easily upset, by the way. You won't necessarily be able to read this. It's quite an important one. I do have copies of this on the Nexus stand. And no, you don't have to buy a copy of Nexus as well. We'll give you that. There's about 40 or 50. Conventional chronology, revised chronology, and biblical history. You're comparing the three areas. The revised chronology is what Velikovsky claimed was more likely to have happened. It's quite technical, it's quite detailed, it's absolutely fascinating. Egyptian chronology is based on something called Sothic dating, which I will not go into, but it's based on a complete fallacy. The whole of Egyptian chronology is wrong. Simple. 18th, 19th dynasty, it's the one everybody's heard of. Tutmosis, 3rd and 4th, Hatshepsut. Those who've been to Egypt will have seen Hatshepsut's temple. They lived 500 years later than Egyptologists will tell you. And the reason is the Sothic dating is completely wrong. Dating it from a known event in history, this is the Exodus in 1450. We know that various people here, Solomon, David, existed. And the key point is Tutankhamun. We all know about Tutankhamun. Died in about 1320 BC, we're told. Absolutely wrong, completely idiots who believed that he died in 1320, Howard Carter included. But he didn't know any better, because they hadn't invented carbon-14 dating. In 1971, that's how long it took to get a piece of papyrus from Tutankhamun's tomb carbon dated accurately. The carbon date given for a piece of papyrus taken from Tutankhamun's tomb, which had not been disturbed until Howard Carter went in 1922, the date given was 840 BC, 500 years later than he's supposed to have lived there, 1350. Tutankhamun, 840. Sheila's not going to let me have time to explain about the Queen of Sheba, but the Queen of Sheba was an Egyptian pharaoh who went to visit Solomon. It's all recorded in Egyptian history and in biblical history. So anybody who tells you that that idiot talking about Egyptian history down in Glastonbury that day at the end of July 2007 doesn't know what he's talking about, just challenge them to come up with a better explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus.